All right, everyone. Well, welcome back to That Fitness Couple. We are super excited for today's conversation. We know that this is one that you guys have been waiting for. And even if you're sitting there saying, Mike, have I really been waiting for this? Trust me. If
Yeah.
you've been listening to what we've been discussing for about almost a year now
Yeah.
with respect to nutrition, you're going to love this conversation. And that's because our guest today is Dr. Philip Ovadia, and he is a cardiac surgeon who emphasizes the importance of metabolic health and eating whole, real foods, including animal-based proteins. He is the author of Stay Off My Operating Table, where he shares knowledge and insights that could possibly put him out of a job. So, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Mike and Corey Beth. Great to be here with you. Really excited to have this conversation and make sure that your audience does get excited about preventative heart health and staying off my operating table.
Excellent, excellent. Well, the way we like to open up this show is we're going to just give you some rapid fire, true or false. You can answer true, false, or if you feel like it's something that needs a caveat, you could go ahead and add that in. And after we've gone through all the questions, we'll circle back around and do a deep dive on each of these topics. Sound good?
Sounds good.
So, true or false, or caveat, you have been a cardiac surgeon for 20 years.
That is definitely true.
All right. Number two, for a large part of your career, you were on the brink of being a cardiac patient yourself.
Yes, true as well. I was destined to end up on my own operating table.
Wow. Well, and true or false, the reason is because you followed the nutrition advice given by most cardiologists.
Yes, true as well.
All right. Number four, saturated fat is harmful for our heart health.
I am confident in saying that's false, and I don't even have to give a caveat for it.
I love it.
Next, LDL cholesterol is the most reliable predicator of heart disease.
Definitely false as well.
All right. Number six, a person's metabolic health is the most reliable predictor of heart disease.
That one is true.
Awesome. Next up, eating too little protein is a bigger problem than eating too much fat.
That one is true as well.
Excellent. And finally, number eight, genetics play the biggest role in heart disease.
And that one is false.
All right. So we have a lot to deep dive on today. As we were alluding to, our audience knows that we are big proponents of a carnivore or an animal-based or an ancestral-based diet, however you like to term it. And we've had a lot of doctors on this show, but never a cardiac surgeon. So that's why I know that they're very excited, because I'm sure you know as well, the number one question that always comes up when anybody talks about any type of high protein diet, and especially an animal-based one, is heart disease. But before we go into that, I think it would be fun to just share a little bit of your story. I mean, you talk about it in your book. Like, give our audience an idea of who you are and how did you arrive at the things that you're recommending?
Yeah, sure thing. And, as you alluded to in the questions, I've been a cardiac surgeon now for 20 years, continue to practice as a cardiac surgeon. But for much of that time, I was very unhealthy, and I had reached a point where I was morbidly obese, I was pre-diabetic, and I knew that I was going to end up on my own operating table, so to speak. Like so many of my patients, I didn't know how to change, my path. And I was following the advice, that I had learned to give, the advice we've all heard: eat less, move more, eat a low-fat diet, follow the food pyramid. It wasn't working for me, and it wasn't working for my patients. Thankfully, I started to come across different information. I started to ask different questions, and I ultimately found, a low carbohydrate approach, which kind of went through the evolution of low carb, keto, ultimately carnivore now. And I've had great success. I've been able to maintain that success, which is a big difference from before. Ultimately, have lost over 100 pounds, which I've been able to maintain, and truly in the best shape of my life now. And this really led me to re-examine some things that I had been told about heart disease, that I thought I knew about heart disease. And, we're going to get into a lot of the dogma that we all have heard, that it turns out, is not quite what we've been led to believe. And I now recognize that most of the work I do as a heart surgeon is preventable and shouldn't be needed in the first place. And, something that I've always kind of recognized, but truly understand now, is that no matter how good I might be as a heart surgeon, all the heart surgeons and cardiologists out there might be, you're never as good after you have heart surgery as you would have been if you didn't need the surgery in the first place. And I now know that there is a path to not need the heart surgery. And that's the path that I would prefer to lead people down.
That is so profound and so rare, I'm sure, in your industry. Are you popular or not very popular among your peers? I got to know.
Well, it's pretty interesting. So yes, I get a lot of pushback, especially on social media, and out there. I'll get attacked for my quackery and my, the cardiologists that are just so bought into the dogma and can't see their way out of it. Privately, a lot of my doctor colleagues are like, yeah, we know you're right. We can't talk to our patients about that. It's not in the guidelines and we don't have time. And, all the unfortunate excuses that the healthcare system makes for not focusing on preventative health. But, I believe that is first and foremost what doctors should be doing. We should be doing all we can to prevent people from getting sick in the first place, as opposed to, only trying to manage their illness, which is basically what we do in medicine these days. We're basically just trying to make them less sick. We've lost sight of the fact that we can prevent them from getting sick in the first place. And if we identify root causes of why people are getting sick, in most cases, you can reverse and, really improve their condition rather than just sort of managing it with medications.
Well, I want to get into the root cause in just a moment, but I think what's great is, first of all, you have a phenomenally named website. It's ifixhearts.com. And you would think that by logging on there, we're going to see open heart surgery and, some elaborate design of you going in for surgery. And yet, the information that you're delivering is all about prevention. Mm-hmm. And I think it's amazing. And, again, we applaud you for putting it out there that you are literally trying to put yourself out of a job by presenting this information. So we talked a little bit about it in the True and False, which was around metabolic health. So can we just do a little bit of a deeper dive on metabolic health, like help explain to everybody what metabolic health is, because they may hear us throw those terms around, but they don't quite understand what that means.
Yeah. The simplest way to think about it is metabolic health really describes our body's ability to utilize the inputs that we're giving it. And the primary input that we give our bodies is the food that we eat. And, when we eat food, one of three things happens to that food. We either immediately turn it into energy to use to fuel our bodies. We break it down into its components and use it to build and rebuild our tissues, a process that's always going on within our bodies, or we put it into storage. We put it, convert it into energy and then put it into storage for later use. And the problem that we find ourselves in today is that most of us have put too much energy into storage. We never really give our bodies a chance to use that energy that we've stored. And this then leads to a whole host of problems that can manifest in many different ways. But most of the chronic diseases that we face today, things like heart disease, things like Alzheimer's disease, many forms of cancer, you can go down the list of the things that people die from. And it turns out that the vast majority of them can be tied back to metabolic health and have their root cause in metabolic health. So the power of understanding, managing, measuring your metabolic health is that you can then have the tools and the information that you need to prevent and reverse these chronic diseases.
Just amazing. I mean, like how do we arrive here? We go to doctors ourselves, and I think it's amazing. Go ahead. You want to add something first?
I want to jump in. So what would be those things that people should be looking at to determine whether or not they are in good metabolic health? Like, what are some of the things that they can being tested for, or just, look for themselves, easy measures?
Yeah, so exactly. So there are 5 basic measures that I always point people to first. If you go to my website, ifixhearts.com, right on the front page, there is a free quiz that's going to march you through these measures. So don't worry about getting all the numbers down. The information is there. But the key is to gather this information, figure out these 5 things, and use that to determine if you're metabolically healthy or not. So the first 2, like you said, you can measure them yourselves at home. You don't need your doctor to do this. The first is going to be your waist circumference. You just get a tape measure. You measure just above the level of your belly button. Do that first thing in the morning. And that's going to be a powerful indicator of metabolic health. Turns out that that's actually one of the best predictors in and of itself of metabolic health. The next measure we're going to look at is your blood pressure. And again, you can measure this at home. Almost every time you go to the pharmacy, the grocery store, they have the kiosk there to check it. And just about every time you go and see your doctor, you're going to get your blood pressure checked. High blood pressure, another early indicator of metabolic health problems. And unfortunately, most doctors don't think of it that way. They just say, here's a medication, it will lower your blood pressure, and they're not thinking about why is this patient's blood pressure elevated in the first place. Then there are 3 lab tests that we're going to look at. And again, most doctors are actually going to check these as part of their routine panel. They just don't put the pieces together properly to figure out if someone is metabolically healthy or not. You're going to look at your fasting blood glucose level, the amount of sugar that's in your bloodstream when you haven't eaten for, 8 to 12 hours roughly. You can also look at your hemoglobin A1C, which is a measurement that's going to give you a 3-month average of your blood glucose. But you want to know about your blood glucose control. Then, we're going to look at the cholesterol panel. And the cholesterol panel is likely what your doctor spends the most time looking at or talking to you about. But unfortunately, they focus on LDL cholesterol on that panel. And it's actually 2 other numbers on that panel that we want to look at to help us determine if we're metabolically healthy. There's your triglyceride number and your HDL cholesterol number. And so if you take those 5 measurements, waist circumference, blood pressure, blood glucose, HDL, and triglycerides, that is going to give you some very good information about whether or not you're metabolically healthy. Scary statistic, 88% of the adults in the United States cannot meet those 5 measures of metabolic health. So in other words, only 12% of the adults in the US can meet all 5 measures of metabolic health. And that's the big problem that we're facing today. Because if 3 or more of those are outside the healthy range, you actually have a medical diagnosis. We call it the metabolic syndrome. And the metabolic syndrome means that you are at very much increased risk for things like heart disease, many types of cancer, Alzheimer's disease, chronic kidney disease. You just keep going down and down the list of the conditions that are associated with the metabolic syndrome.
Let's go to, because you mentioned with the blood panels, right? Most doctors will spend their time there. But as we had mentioned also in the True and Full, LDLs, right? That is the most talked about of all of the measures in terms of our blood lipids. And you were saying that is probably, well, you didn't even mention it, number one, in these 5 measures. And yet, as I said, that is what most cardiologists are looking at. So where does that fit into this story?
Yeah. And understand, these aren't 5 measures that I made up. These are the well-accepted criteria used around the world to measure metabolic health and diagnose the metabolic syndrome. And there's a very good reason that LDL cholesterol is not included. And that's because it doesn't have anything to do with metabolic health. Now, this is where I think we really got things wrong about LDL cholesterol, because I want people to understand it's not that cholesterol doesn't play a role in the development of heart disease. It's that cholesterol is not the root cause. It's not the inciting event. And the other thing that we've gotten wrong about cholesterol is that it's not important the amount of cholesterol that you have in your bloodstream. It's the quality of the cholesterol that you have in your bloodstream. And so, most doctors are focused on LDL. And when you look at a population level, there are some weak associations between LDL levels and heart disease. But those associations are not very good. And to give you an idea, there have been studies done that have shown that up to 75% of the patients that come into the hospital with a heart attack will have levels of LDL cholesterol that are not considered elevated. Many of the patients that end up on my operating table don't have elevated LDL cholesterol levels. Some of them because they're on medications that are lowering their LDL cholesterol. Some of them just naturally have lower levels of LDL cholesterol. And it really has a very weak, if any, association with predicting heart disease. On the flip side of things, there are many people that are walking around with high levels of LDL cholesterol, but they're not at risk of heart disease. And the reason that they're not at risk of heart disease is because LDL is a family of particles that carry cholesterol around. And it turns out that broadly, there are 2 types of LDL particles. There are what we call small, dense particles, and these are problematic and do get involved in the formation of plaque in our blood vessels. But then there are also large, fluffy, large, buoyant LDL cholesterol particles that don't get involved in plaque formation. And when your doctor has only checked the basic lipid panel and is looking at the total amount of your LDL cholesterol, the information that they're not getting and the information that's important is which type of those particles, do you primarily have? And that's what really leads us to, getting a better understanding of your risk of heart disease.
Okay, so how would we measure that though? So someone says, I want to know, do I have these dense lipids or do I have these fluffy ones? How would we go about finding that out?
Yeah, so you can get it measured directly. You can get what's called an advanced lipid panel, or it will be called an NMR panel. Sometimes it's called lipoprotein fractionation. But ask your doctor for, you want to know what your particle sizes are. And, that blood test can be done. Turns out it's not even that expensive, although most doctors think it is. So that's one reason why they don't order it more. But even more important is that we should understand why you end up with small, dense particles versus large, fluffy particles. And that's what leads us back to metabolic health. So, the primary determinant of the size of your lipid particles is going to be whether or not you are insulin resistant. And insulin resistance is really, what metabolic health is all about. People who are not metabolically healthy, they are insulin resistant. That's the medical term. And again, there's some testing that we can do to determine that. But that's really ultimately what I want to know about someone if I'm figuring out, are they at risk for heart disease or not? And if they already have heart disease, why did they get it? And what can we do to stop the progression and even reverse it?
So let me step in here for a second. What is the mechanism then? So somebody has, say, again, poor metabolic health. What is the mechanism that causes that to result in clogged arteries? Because that's what we always hear from doctors, your artery is X% closed. So what caused that plaque buildup? If it's not a question of, I mean, I know you mentioned the density, but what else is happening that's causing that buildup?
Yeah, so it is a complex process. I'll say that off the bat. There isn't one simple way to explain it, but some common things that we look at, some key events that need to occur for that plaque to build up is, first of all, the wall of the blood vessel, the lining of the blood vessel, what we call the endothelium, needs to be damaged because, cholesterol is in our bloodstream from birth until death. It is a vital substance. We literally cannot live without it. And the question is, why would this substance that's floating around in our blood all of a sudden start to cause plaques? And one of the things that needs to happen for that to occur is there needs to be damage to the blood vessel. So that lining that normally separates, the wall of the blood vessel from the blood that's flowing through it, that needs to be damaged. And there are lots of things that can cause damage to the blood vessel. But again, insulin resistance is one of those things. High blood sugar is another one of those things. And high blood sugar results from the insulin resistance. Things like smoking and other toxins that we breathe in or that we eat can cause damage to the lining of the blood vessels. So that's the first thing that needs to occur. And then cholesterol, it turns out, is the body's repair mechanism for the damage. So your body sends the cholesterol to try and, think of it as patching the hole or the spackle that you're going to use to repair your wall when there's a hole in it. And the body sends cholesterol there. Now, if everything's working correctly, and if the cholesterol itself isn't damaged, the cholesterol is going to repair that hole. We're going to sand it down real nice. We're going to paint over it, and everything's going to look good. But if we keep coming along and punching more and more holes in that wall, and now we need more and more spackle, and, the spackle starts to get dried out and it doesn't, it's not smooth anymore and it's not sanded down. And now we have a big problem because now that spackle's sticking out of the wall. Other blood vessels that are coming along are now getting stuck to it. And this is how the plaque starts to build up. So, again, yes, you can maybe have a little bit of impact on that process by trying to take the cholesterol out of the system. But the real answer is, why is the wall getting damaged? Why are the cholesterol particles getting damaged? And what can we do about that if we want to have an impact on heart disease?
Oh my gosh. I'm like, hold on. Can we just back up the bus? So you are saying cholesterol is good for us.
Yeah, cholesterol, like I said, we cannot live without cholesterol. Cholesterol plays many important and vital roles in our bodies. Cholesterol is what makes up the actual wall, the structure of our cells. Cholesterol is a precursor for many of our essential hormones, including the sex hormones, testosterone, progesterone, estrogen. These things are all made from cholesterol. And cholesterol plays a very important role in our immune systems. It helps us to fight off infection. It helps us to fight off cancer. So there are many vital purposes to cholesterol. And like I said, the only reason that cholesterol becomes problematic is because we start doing damage to our blood vessels. We keep doing damage to our blood vessels. The cholesterol particles get damaged themselves by these same processes. And if you have a lot of healthy cholesterol floating around in your bloodstream, I think that's an optimal way for human beings to be living. And that's really, I think, what we should be aiming for.
Say, the way that you just broke that down for me personally, it makes so much sense. We've been on this carnivore, primal, ancestral lifestyle now, Mike, for over a year, myself for 9 months. And the way that you made that so visual for me, I almost think about it like a house, and the foundation is our blood vessels, right? And if we have this rain coming by, blood, not a big deal. But you put acid in the rain, now we have acid rain that's eroding our foundation. It makes sense. And every time you call the mason back and you're patching it up, it becomes a disaster. So really, the only way to truly heal or get better is to change our lifestyle. It's to get the acid rain away from the foundation. Yes?
Yeah, exactly. We need to address these underlying factors, the insulin resistance and the metabolic disease that's causing all this trouble in the first place.
It's a beautiful lead in then to nutritionally, what do we need to do? Because the approach that has been taken up to this point is, oh, let's reduce our cholesterol. Let's reduce our consumption of saturated fat, which, as you brilliantly pointed out, it wouldn't be a problem in that one area of the body had not for all the other damage that we're doing through our approach to nutrition. And so we've been led to believe that we should not be eating lots of red meat, especially fatty red meat, that saturated fat is something to be avoided. And yet here you resolved your own health issues eating in that fashion and are now encouraging others to do the same. So let's just talk about the nutritional component here and the effect that eating, say, a carnivore diet or even just a higher protein, higher fat diet is going to have on an individual.
Yeah. So, the first thing is to understand about saturated fat. Saturated fat was hypothesized to be what was driving the growing heart disease epidemic, in the US going back to the 1950s. And, some scientific evidence was put forth in support of that theory. It turns out that much of that evidence was either poorly done or fraudulent, intentionally misleading. But we now know, there have now been multiple recent large, what we call meta-analyses that look at, the totality of the data around saturated fat. And it has been conclusively shown that saturated fat in the diet is not an issue. So much so that, the American Heart Association and the US Dietary Guidelines removed the limits on saturated fat from their recommendations. Now, they didn't publicize that, but if you look through the current recommendations from those organizations, you'll find that there is no longer a limitation on saturated fat. Because again, the totality of the evidence shows that saturated fat by itself is not problematic. The real problem probably occurred because when people eat saturated fat, they're oftentimes eating other things with it that are harmful. And these are things like highly refined carbohydrates. These are things like sugar that clearly are harmful to our metabolic health. They lead to us becoming insulin resistant and ultimately lead to all of these problems that we've discovered, that we talked about. So I want people to understand no reason to fear saturated fat in the diet. What you do want to avoid is processed food, and that includes highly processed carbohydrates. That includes, added sugars, and that's going to include things like vegetable and seed oils, which are actually high in what we call polyunsaturated fats. And it turns out that these fats, which were created by the food industry in order to get the saturated fat out of food, in order to give an alternative to saturated fat, but these are things that don't occur in high amounts in nature. We have never eaten them anywhere near the quantities that we've started eating them within the past, 50 to 100 years. And that is likely a very strong driver of the metabolic disease problem that we have, and therefore the heart disease problem that we have as well.
From my understanding, if we went back 120 years ago, polyunsaturated fats, aka omega-6s, it made up maybe 2% of what we were taking in. And now, from my understanding, it's somewhere in the range of 10 to 12% of what we're having. And some people might say, well, that doesn't sound like it's a huge difference. But, again, from a metabolic standpoint, it makes a huge difference inside our body if that's not what we have been, adapted to or designed to take on.
Yeah, and it's actually even higher than that. The average consumption of polyunsaturated fatty acids in the American diet, I believe, is somewhere in the 30 to 40% range actually now. And you're right, ancestrally, and even as recently as, 150, 200 years ago, it was in the 1% to 2% range, because these things don't occur in high amounts in nature. Yes, there's some in, there's some in meats, there's some in, plants, nuts, things like that are going to have some of these things, but nowhere near the concentrated amounts that we're now introducing into people's food supply in these processed foods that contain these vegetable and seed oils.
It makes total sense, especially here in America. You don't sit down and have a beef patty for your burger. You've got the burger and the bun and the fries and the soda, and
Yep.
it's extra large, and you get a brownie to follow up because, you got to have dessert. But people are like, don't eat red meat. I mean, it's lunacy, isn't it?
Yeah, no, that's really what has happened, because most of the evidence that was ever used against saturated fat was this epidemiologic evidence, which just basically tracks what people eat and, tries to correlate that to outcomes. And that's exactly the problem, that when most people say they eat red meat, they're eating a meal exactly like you describe. And, I think there was some influence of politics, religion, and just, kind of the scientific buy-in to this theory that they said, well, it's got to be the red meat. It can't be all that other stuff.
I mean, there's this thing called corporate greed. I mean, I totally don't think it's a real thing, but you really never know, right?
Well,
Yeah,
you have
exactly.
You have all the studies, on how healthy a vegan diet is, which is based all on the Seventh-day Adventists, right? Who that's all they eat. And then you have, like you were alluding to, I mean, the Ansel Keys research that had been done back in the late 50s, early 60s, that brought us to this place of all the highly processed fats that we're now consuming. And it's amazing because there was a time where, I know we oftentimes will villainize sugar, but there was a time where people still were eating maybe not a grandiose amount of sugar per day, but having sugar every single day along with their fatty meat. And these still were not morbidly obese people. These were not people who were suffering from all of these, again, Western diseases. I know a lot of people like to say, well, there's no research to prove that it's seed oils, but it's like, when you single it out, there's not much else that's changed. I mean, you look at charts over the course of decades and the consumption of dairy versus meat versus fruit versus vegetables versus sugar, and most of that has remained largely unchanged until you hit the late 90s and early 2000s, where suddenly there's this spike in seed oils like we've never seen before. And a lot of the reason why we only saw a spike then was because they didn't have to report that it was specifically seed oils that was in our food supply. But we know it's been happening long before then. So it is just amazing to look back and see, how our diets have changed and how they have evolved in a very negative way, and what it's leading to. What I would love to just jump into, unless you had something else.
I got a question.
Okay.
I just got to know this, Doc.
I felt it.
You did feel it.
I felt it.
He's very intuitive. You've operated on people's hearts. Have you seen plaque buildup in people's hearts?
Yes. Yeah. We, I do get the opportunity to actually look at these plaques as part of what I do.
So let me ask this. If I'm understanding this analogy we made before with like the acid rain, which is basically, sugar and insulin resistance, we have this eroding our foundation, meaning our blood cell walls, our blood vessel walls. A cardiologist opens up someone's heart and says, oh gosh, there's all this plaque because it's this constant repair. Like the mason keeps coming back, keeps patching. Is that why we think cholesterol is not good? Because we see this buildup of cholesterol repair or plaque? Like, is that why?
Well, yeah, when you do look at these plaques, there is cholesterol in them. And that was, what led us to, we said, okay, there's cholesterol in the plaques. And then we said, okay, it must be coming from the cholesterol that we're eating in our food. Again, what we failed to understand was, the part of the process where the blood vessel wall gets damaged, the cholesterol particles themselves get damaged. And, there's even debate about where the cholesterol is coming from. For instance, our red blood cells, the cells that carry, oxygen around in our blood, they have a fair amount of cholesterol in them because Like I said, cholesterol makes up the wall of our cells. And so it turns out now that there's one theory that the cholesterol that we're seeing in plaques is from red blood cells that got trapped in these plaques, break down, and we're left with the cholesterol there. And, there are a few prominent cardiologists out there that point to heart disease as primarily a blood clotting problem. And these plaques are just the result, again, of our body, resolving these blood clots and what's left over, after the blood clot. So there's lots about this process that we've misunderstood, still don't understand. There are lots of competing theories that kind of got ignored and suppressed because they didn't fit this narrative. And, the narrative really got complicated around the 1990s, late 1980s, early 1990s, when we had all of these medications, come out that lower people's cholesterol levels, because now we had a very real economic incentive to keep believing this theory that it was all about cholesterol. But it's interesting when you go back to the medical literature from prior to then, the 1970s, the early 1980s, there's very active debate about, how much of a role cholesterol played in the development of, heart disease, how much things like sugar and insulin resistance was very prominently put forward as one of the driving forces between heart disease. When you look at those studies that directly compare the risk associated with insulin resistance and the risk associated with elevated cholesterol, total cholesterol or LDL cholesterol most commonly, it's not even close. The magnitude of the risk associated with insulin resistance is much, much higher than the magnitude of the risk associated with elevated cholesterol levels. And the only reason that we focus so much on cholesterol is because we have multiple medications that we can prescribe to lower people's cholesterol level. We do not have a medication that treats insulin resistance. And that, I think, is, what really kept us on that pathway of cholesterol and has gotten us to where we are today, that it's now just accepted as dogma. And it's hard to even question that narrative.
Yes, this follow-up question then. I mean, gosh, you're just, all these fired explosions are going off in my brain as you're speaking. So we come in and we say cholesterol is the bad guy. We're now going to take medication to lower cholesterol. It's almost like adding water to that mortar so the masons can't really patch the hole so well. What other repercussions happen as a result of us lowering our cholesterol with medication?
Well, there are a number of concerns related to that. Some of the data that we're seeing around people that are now on these medications for long periods of time. Remember, like all medications, when these things get studied before they're released to the market, they get studied for 2 years, 3 years, maybe 5 years at the most. But here we are now 30 years into this, and we've had people that are on these medications longer term, and we're starting to see some concerning signals. There's a very real concern around the longer you're on cholesterol-lowering medications, statins, the higher your risk is of developing, wait for it, insulin resistance and diabetes, which we know to be the primary driver of heart disease. So that's a big red flag for me. There's some other signals around development of Alzheimer's disease, neurologic diseases. And again, that makes sense because the brain is made of about 80% cholesterol. So you can think that there might be some negative implications of trying to lower your cholesterol level. Other, concerning data starts to come up when you look at the long-term people on these medications for long periods of time. More concerning to me, however, though, than the possible side effects is just the absolute ineffectiveness of these medications. And again, when you look at the data around these, and this is the best data around these medications, the trials that are oftentimes led by the pharmaceutical company, data that sometimes is not allowed to be examined by third parties, by outside parties. But even if we accept it at face value, the best data that you can show for the benefit of statin medications in people who have not had a heart attack shows us that the absolute risk reduction, the absolute amount that we're lowering the risk of someone having a heart attack after being on these medications is about 1%. Now, when you go to your doctor and you ask about the benefits of statins, they're going to tell you, oh, they reduce your risk of heart disease by 40% or 50%. And you're going to say, well, how can that be if they're just reducing it 1%? And this is one of the tricks that the pharmaceutical company plays. Your doctor has been educated by the pharmaceutical company to talk to you about something called relative risk reduction. And I'm talking about absolute risk reduction. So you can picture if someone has a 2% chance of developing heart disease, and then we put them on a medication and it reduces their risk to 1%, you've reduced their risk 1%. But the pharmaceutical company says, no, we've reduced their risk by 50% because we've cut it in half from 2% to 1%. And so, this just muddies the picture, confuses people even more when we get into this. So ultimately, like I said, the science is real clear. Insulin resistance, much, much bigger risk factor for heart disease than cholesterol is. And so I want to focus on the insulin resistance. I think the cholesterol is really a distractor. And it turns out that when you eliminate the insulin resistance, the cholesterol is no longer problematic.
Along those lines, you talk in your book about insulin resistance, you talk about metabolic health, and so you discuss there's 7 principles to help us better establish our metabolic health. So would you mind just listing out what those 7 principles are? And if you don't mind going into maybe 2 or 3 of them in a little bit more depth?
Yeah, so the first principle I think is very important for people to understand. And that principle says that we want to think of our health as a system, not as a goal. And this is kind of the mindset behind all this. When we set short-term goals for ourselves, as we usually do around our health, we say, I want to lose 20 pounds. One of 2 things happens. You make a bunch of changes, you lose the 20 pounds, and you say, great, I accomplished my goal. And now I can kind of go back to what I was doing before. And most people do. And, they end up gaining back the weight and more. Or probably actually more commonly, you don't lose the 20 pounds because it's hard and you get discouraged and you just kind of give up and you go back to what you're doing before. So instead, I want to refocus people. I want them to think of their health as a system. And I want them to adopt the habits that are going to optimize that system for them. And this is where metabolic health and understanding insulin resistance comes into play. This is where you're setting positive habits for yourself to follow instead of thinking about what you're taking away, the traditional approach to dieting. Obviously, I put that first because I think that's most important. The other principles are going to go into, kind of the practicalities of doing this. And I have 4, kind of pillars that you want to pay attention to. You want to first and foremost be looking at the food that you're eating, because as I said, that is the primary input that we are giving our bodies, and that is going to be the primary determinant of whether or not we are metabolically healthy. And, from a food standpoint, again, I go into lots of options in the book, but ultimately, if you are metabolically unhealthy, that means your body cannot process carbohydrates and you need to lower your carbohydrate intake as much as possible. And then, the real meta principle here, the big concept that I want people to understand is you need to eat whole, real food. Eliminate the processed food, eat the things that grow in the ground, and eat the things that eat the things that grow in the ground. Now, there's a variation there. You can eat lots of meat. You can eat lots of vegetables. You can do lots of things in between. And they both are and can be done in an effective way that will keep you metabolically healthy. And honestly, they both have things that can you can do that will end up with you not being metabolically healthy. And so I always want people to focus on metabolic health first and foremost. If your diet is improving your metabolic health, allowing you to remain metabolically healthy, then I'm all for it. Besides your diet, the other things that you need to be paying attention to, and I know your audience will have heard this, the activity that you're getting, the sleep that you're getting, and how you're managing your stress. These are, 3 other things that are very important as well. I always tell people, you still got to focus on the diet first, because if you're not getting the diet right, you're really not going to be able to overcome that with those other 3. But, if you're getting the diet right and you're ignoring those other 3, you're also not going to be getting the results that you're looking for. One other principle that I mentioned in the book that I think is important for people is you need to find a doctor or a practitioner of some sort to be your partner in this journey. You need to find a doctor who gets it and can help you understand this, who they themselves understand metabolic health and can help you put these principles into practice.
This is awesome. I think, and the principles are timeless. These are the same things that we should be focused on. And yes, you're correct. Like, our audience is very well aware of this. And I would say that most of them are following through. I wanted to touch, though, on something we had mentioned also, and I think it's important. I have 2 things left, just so you know.
Okay.
I'm going to save my big one for last.
Okay.
But for this one, I wanted to get into genetics a little bit. Because I've heard you talk about the role of genetics, or the role that genetics don't play. And I have a very personal story around this. But before I get into that, I would just love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, so I think when we look overall, genetics end up playing a small role in this. Not that they have no role, but it's not as big a role as we've been led to believe. What I see oftentimes happens out there is the doctor will give you advice. The advice then ends up not working, and they will say, oh, well, it must have been your genetics. It's kind of used as a scapegoat. And it turns out that, yes, genetics certainly influences a lot of these things that we talk about. There are some people who are going to be more prone to becoming insulin resistant and will more easily become insulin resistant. And there are other people, and we know these people that eat a lousy diet their whole life and they never become insulin resistant. And they probably have, some genetic influence there. When we look at heart disease in particular, there are definitely some things that specifically can influence your risk of developing heart disease. There's something called lipoprotein A, for instance. That's a certain type of cholesterol carrying particle that puts you at higher risk for heart disease. And it's largely genetically influenced whether or not you have a high lipoprotein A level or not. However, whatever genetic window you've been sort of dealt, there's still a good end and a bad end of that. And that's where I believe the habits that you adopt are so powerful, because we can improve within that window. We may be within this range and someone else is in this range, but there's always room to move within that range. And that's where our habits come into play. One of the sayings that oftentimes gets repeated that I think is very true is, genetics load the gun, but it's your habits that pull the trigger.
Yeah, I mean, that one resonates a lot with us. And this conversation does resonate with me on a very personal level, because, I had the experience of my father having triple bypass surgery at the age of 41. So at that time, I was around 13 years old or so. And so it had sort of, and he's alive. He, for the last 30 years, though, he's had to go in for multiple stents. I think he's up to 58, something like that. And so it's been an ongoing thing where within our family, it's always reminded, like, hey, don't forget about, your father. Like, there's this potential for you. And, I've always kind of taken that to heart. My passion for fitness has played out since I was a teen. I mean, and I've always focused, of course, there's been periods of my life where I've not necessarily eaten well. Exercise has always played a major role. And generally speaking, I've kept myself very, very healthy. And, I've always felt that even though there's been this thing looming over me that, hey, you really should watch, because I'm in my mid 40s right now, and it's like, you should watch. But internally, I've always felt like, no, I'm good. I feel like I'm good because, I feel as though I would know, like, deep inside, if there was truly something wrong, or if I was trending in the wrong direction. And I feel like all the decisions up to this point, not that every single one has worked out perfectly, but we sort of arrived at a place with our nutrition and our exercise where, I don't feel as though those genetics would have any effect on me. And so that's why I wanted to bring this up, because I've heard you speak about it before. And for me, it's very encouraging, as well as to, my other family members who also really work hard at keeping themselves in good shape. And, God bless my father. Like, in this past year, he lost about 30 pounds. He's in the best shape of his life. I mean, in his later adult life, but he's in tremendous shape. He looks amazing, feels good. He's following, again, a predominantly animal-based diet now, which he had not been doing for a very long time. Yeah. He resistance trains twice per week following our program. And it's been awesome to watch how, this supposed genetic issue, even he's been able to put himself in a better place because he's been working on his metabolic health.
Yeah, exactly. And, that's what's so true. And yeah, a scenario like that, yes, again, you may have a genetic ability to develop heart disease that other people perhaps don't, or propensity that perhaps other people don't. But your habits are going to be a much more powerful influence over your lifetime than, whatever those genes might be. And, you've taken a very powerful approach. Sounds like your dad has taken a very powerful approach as well. And, having worked with many patients like your dad, I am confident in saying those changes that he's made are very likely to slow and stop the progression of his heart disease, so he doesn't have to continue going back for all these stents. And that's another important message that I try and get to people. It's never too late. You can always improve from where you are. We might not be able to undo all the damage, but you can always improve from where you are. And it's never too late to start paying attention to what you're eating, what activity you're getting, how you're sleeping, how you're managing your stress, and start improving your life. And one other thing that I think is very important to mention before we go, there is a very good test that we can use to determine early on whether or not people are developing plaque in their arteries and developing heart disease. And this is a test that I really encourage everyone to get to understand, what a powerful tool it is. It's called a coronary artery calcium scan. It's a type of CT scan, CAT scan, that is very easily done. They don't have to put an IV in you. Literally takes 5 minutes. And in most locations in the United States, you can get this test done for around $100. And it's very, very underutilized. I encourage everyone, go out, get that test, understand what it means, but it's going to show you at the very early stages whether you're starting to form plaque. And that gives you, motivation to do something about it.
Amazing. I'm sure everybody is very grateful for that piece of advice. And if you don't mind, I just have one more thing that I'd like to put out there and get your thoughts on it. This is related to the activity piece around exercise. And, our program is built around time efficiency. So we only have people train 2 to 3 times per week for 30 minutes, all resistance training based. And, when people would ask me in the past about, well, what about cardio? Don't I need to be doing cardio? My response has always been, no, you don't need to do cardio, because you're actually getting all of your cardiovascular benefit from the resistance training. And the way that I would position it, and you can tell me if this is accurate or not, but our cardiorespiratory health is based largely on the strength and development of our muscles. I mean, yep. When we think about it, the easy analogy is to think, if I brought you into New York City, put you at the bottom of the Empire State Building, told you to go ahead and walk all the way to the top, how are you going to feel when you get up there? And chances are most people are going to feel somewhat winded. They're going to feel their heart pounding a little bit. But if I brought you back down, and because I'm the magical muscle fairy, I can bless you with hips and thighs that are 50 to 60% stronger than they just were. And now I have you do the same thing. When you get to the top, will you be as winded? Will your heart be pounding? No. Why? Because it has everything to do with your muscular development and strength. And this idea that we need to work out our heart via cardio is flawed, because we can really approach this from the other end, which is, hey, let's address the muscles. And this way our heart and lungs don't have to work as hard. So just your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so I agree that, prioritizing the building and maintenance of muscle mass as we age is the most important factor. And I'm a big fan of resistance exercise as well. I'm a big fan of efficiency, as you guys are as well. So there's a number of unique advantages that muscle gives us when it comes to our metabolic health. So muscle, it turns out, is the best place for our body to put excess sugar, because our muscles will burn through it and we can store some in there as well. And the more muscle you have, the more protection you're going to have against the metabolic effects of some of these foods that you might eat. Data is very clear, that maintenance of muscle mass as we age is the best predictor of not only how long we will live, but the quality of life that we will have as well. So I also prioritize building and maintaining muscle. I tell people, if you want to do the cardio, if you have time to do the cardio after your resistance exercise, have at it. Just understand that, first of all, it's not helping you lose weight, as we've been told. It's been shown study after study that it is not an effective weight loss tool. And, that you need to focus first and foremost on building and maintaining muscle. And the cardio is, after that, if you have the time and the desire to do that.
I love that. I mean, I'm going to go so far as to say, and you could correct me if I'm wrong, you kind of we have doctor backing then for our program. Resistance training is good for heart health.
Yes, no, resistance training is very good for heart health. As I said, it's one of those other pillars that I talk about in the book for your metabolic health.
Cool.
That's great. Well, we are going to link to that, of course, in the show notes. But in the meantime, if you don't mind just letting everybody know, where is the best place for them to connect with you?
Yeah, so you mentioned it before, iFix Hearts. You can go to the website, ifixhearts.com. You can find all the ways that my team and I work with people to improve their metabolic health. We have courses, we have the book, we have coaching programs, and we have the private telemedicine practice that I work with patients throughout the United States on these issues. And you can find all that information, ifixhearts.com. You can also follow me on social media. I'm most active over on Twitter at ifixhearts. Over on Instagram, just look for my name. I'm Ovadia Heart Health over there. I try to be very out there, do lots of podcasts, host my own podcast, and just trying to find all the different ways that we can to get this information, to the people that need it. Because my team's mission is to prevent 10,000 heart attacks a year. Very lofty goal, but we believe that we can accomplish it, and we are accomplishing it. So come work with us, come join us. Love to see everyone on this journey with us.
Dr. Ovadia, thank you so much for your wisdom, experience, enthusiasm, and personal experience. I mean, we didn't even get into your 100-pound weight loss story, which maybe we'll have to have you back on the show, but we appreciate you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, guys.